A generation ago, an event occurred on the other side of the world, an event which was to burn itself into the collective memory of humanity. In Tiananmen Square in Beijing, students had been gathering for weeks to protest the injustice, brutality, and oppression in their land, and to call for a more humane world. Suddenly, the tanks rolled in, and soon hundreds and quite possibly thousands were massacred. It was a scene that was all too familiar in the 20th century. Budapest, 1956, Lhasa, 1959, Prague, 1968, and so many other times and places. Through the most extreme censorship, the Chinese regime has done everything possible to erase the memory of this event at home. But one image in particular remains forever before our eyes. A photographic image taken almost miraculously at tremendous peril and smuggled out even more miraculously as a lasting tribute to courage. It is the image of the so-called Tank Man. Here we see the morning after the slaughter, after all the others had been silenced, one lone man, a skinny young man with sloped shoulders, stepping in silent, nonviolent resistance in front of a column of tanks right there in the square. More than a dozen tanks rolled towards him and came to a confused halt when he refused to move. In an amazing act of simple courage, he just stood there unmoved and swung his grocery bags at the gigantic tanks towering over him, as if to tell them just to get out of his way and go home. The identity and the fate of Tank Man remain unknown. Yet he is included in Time magazine's list of the 100 most important people of the century. This man who stepped out of nowhere into history on June the 5th, 1989, and then vanished from view forever, changed the world by capturing the hearts of millions. The image of this courageous young man facing the column of tanks is one of the most iconic images of all time and has kept the voices of all those heroic students from being forever silenced. It is an amazing image and one that in its awesome simplicity presents a silent call to all the world, a profile in courage. Have you ever felt like that young man in Tiananmen Square? Have you ever felt that all the tanks in the square and in the world are lined up facing you? Have you ever felt that alone, that defenseless? Have you ever felt the fear that he must have felt? Have you ever been able to muster the courage that that fear brought out in him? Because don't think for an instant that that young man was not afraid. But it was precisely his fear which called forth his courage. Perhaps the indomitable John Wayne knew best when he said, "Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway." Courage, or fortitude, is regarded as one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Those gifts which came down upon the apostles at Pentecost. Those gifts which came down upon the young people of the world in confirmation. Those gifts which make us not only more godlike, but in a very real way more truly human. Courage, however, is not just one of many gifts. It is, in a way, the one which makes the exercise of all the others possible. Or as C.S. Lewis put it, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. What is it that inspires fear in our hearts? In my years of priesthood, I have found many who were scared to death of death. And I suppose that's natural enough, simply because it is something that most of us have never done before. Most of us have at least a spark of fear in the face of dying. But I, for one, am not very much afraid of death. I am often much more afraid of life. It takes courage to live. Sometimes it takes tremendous courage just to get up in the morning and face a new day. We wake up facing those tanks, and we go to bed knowing that those tanks are still there pointing right at us. Life can be terrifying. It takes courage to live. What does it take courage to do? Sometimes we think we show great courage in being unbending towards others. But do you realize how much courage it takes to forgive? Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of great inner strength and courage, and an even greater amount of courage is required to be able to ask for forgiveness ourselves. On March 13th, 2000, Pope John Paul II did something truly extraordinary, unprecedented in the history of the Church and the world. He humbly asked for forgiveness for all the errors and crimes committed by the Church over the past 2,000 years, and he went on to list many of these by name, including the crimes of intolerance and injustice committed against Muslims, Jews, women, and indigenous peoples. He had already apologized, among other things, for the Church's errors against the great scientist and philosopher Galileo, for the Church's persecution and, yes, burning of heretics, for the religious wars following the Protestant Reformation, and for the horrors of the Crusades and the Inquisition. It was truly extraordinary. Not surprisingly, many doctrinaire hardliners in the Church, accustomed to defending even the most indefensible acts, were horrified by the Holy Father's words and continue to this day to berate him for daring to acknowledge errors in the Church itself. They formed a line of tanks in front of him, but John Paul faced those tanks and showed the true face of courage, not only in forgiving others, but in begging forgiveness for the egregious errors of the institution itself. A profile in courage. What does it take courage to do? Certainly it takes courage to live up to what we have pledged to do. But there are times when it takes even more courage to change our mind, change our course, and follow the Spirit down frighteningly unknown paths. Such was the courage of Mother Teresa, who had taken her vows to serve God forever in one particular way of life, but was later inspired to leave that way of life and follow a completely different path. It might have been courageous to resist that, but it was even more courageous of her to follow it. She too dared to face the insurmountable tanks standing in her way of creating a more compassionate world. A profile in courage. What does it take courage to do? Winston Churchill points out that courage is what it takes to stand up and speak, but courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. How right he was, and how few find that singular courage. Sometimes it takes more courage to know when to stop and pass on the torch. The surprising abdication of Pope Benedict XVI was anything but an act of cowardice. It was an act of great courage and humility, and perhaps his greatest gift to the Church, to give us this precedent and show us that it's okay to step down when it is time, even for a pope. A profile in courage. What does it take courage to do? What are we when we do not have courage? You think you know? A populist writer, Jim Hightower, has a marvelous saying. The opposite of courage is not cowardice. It is conformity. Even a dead fish can go with the flow. A dead fish could not stand in Tiananmen Square. A dead fish could neither forgive nor ask forgiveness. A dead fish could not change course and change the world. A dead fish could not step down and hold his head up high. Let us have the courage to swim, even if it is against the flow. Let us have the courage to stand and face the tanks that are poised to crush us. And let us have the courage to allow the Spirit to create of us a new iconic image, a prophet of justice and mercy, a profile in courage for all the world to see.